Welcome to Learning Thursdays. This is Patty, and once again I will be your host for this month's Learning Thursday. As a review, Learning Thursdays are offered to addiction professionals as a free learning opportunity with the goal of improving the knowledge, skills, and perhaps the attitudes of the New York State addiction workforce as we strive to improve the lives of individuals in prevention, treatment, and recovery services. If you would like more Learning Thursdays information, please access the following link. This month's Learning Thursday is entitled Domestic Violence, Intimate Partner Violence, and Lethality Screening, and is being presented to you by Brenda Bannon from New York State OASAS, Mary Alice Ryan from New York State OASAS, and Whitney Benora, Project Coordinator, Universal Response to Domestic Violence. For those of you who are interested, Learning Thursdays are presented free of charge, and they are routinely approved for 1.5 credentialing hours. After you register for the presentation, you will be sent a link for the broadcast, the PowerPoint and handouts, which you will receive with this presentation. There are 2 additional handouts, a sign-in sheet and a credentialing certificate. It is important to send the sign-in sheet to the address indicated on the form, as that's the only proof of attendance at the presentation. Type your name or write it on the space provided, and make sure you maintain that certificate. That's the only copy you'll have. Again, if you have any questions, please send them to learningthurs@oasas.ny.gov. At this point, I'm going to hand the presentation over to Brenda Bannon, and she will begin from here. Thank you. Brenda, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Patty. I am very happy to be here to present on this very important topic, and I am very happy to be here, especially during Domestic Violence Awareness Month. My name is Brenda Bannon, and I work for the Office of Alcoholism and Substance Abuse Services. And I'm here to present on screening and the importance of screening in domestic violence treatment programs. Why screen for DV or IPV, which is domestic violence or intimate partner violence? In 2012, OASAS issued a local service bulletin emphasizing the importance of screening for domestic violence and intimate partner violence, both perpetration and victimization in our treatment programs. Screening is very important because it enhances safety for everyone who is affected by domestic violence. We have patients that come in that are either victims or perpetrators of domestic violence, and having them in our treatment programs certainly puts the possibility of risk within the program. Screening also allows for referral to appropriate DV or IPV services. It increases positive treatment outcomes and reduces relapse rates. The highlighted link on the slide will take you to the local services bulletin if you would like to review it. Out of our OASAS treatment programs, we know that 94% have reported screening for victimization and 80% report screening for perpetration. Screening, as reported by programs, is often identified as a part of the biopsychosocial and not as a standardized tool. When we ask programs to report, we're asking that they report utilizing standardized tools, and the fact that it's indicated that they're using the screening as part of their biopsychosocial may indicate a lack of understanding either of what a standardized tool is or a lack of familiarity with the standardized tools. All programs should be using standardized screening tools to screen for intimate partner violence, victimization, and perpetration for all patients. Screening can be done at admission, during treatment, or at discharge. Screening should be done independently, but counselors should also be watching for any indication or signs of intimate partner violence throughout the treatment process. Standardized screening tools are available. There is a compendium of screening and assessment tools for many domestic violence issues, specifically for victimization and perpetration, available at the CDC website. The link will take you to the compendium where you can look at different tools that have screening for both victimization and perpetration, or just victimization, just perpetration. And the various tools have different styles, different lengths to them. So programs can decide which tool best fits within their program for screening. Referrals for domestic violence services, 91% of our programs refer victims to the following services: DV programs and coalitions, and mental health services. Referrals should not be made to mental health services unless the mental health services specifically have expertise in domestic or intimate partner violence. The most appropriate referral would be to a local DV program. For perpetrators, 77% of our programs state that they're referring perpetrators to the following services: either a spousal abuse or batterers group, an anger management program, or mental health therapy. Anger management is never an appropriate referral for perpetrators of domestic violence. Domestic violence is not an anger management issue. Mental health therapy, again, is only appropriate to be a referral for a perpetrator if the therapist has expertise in domestic violence or intimate partner violence. Programs should be working with local domestic violence programs. OASAS programs should be developing working relationships with their local domestic violence program so that there's an improved ability for a referral to those services, so that DV education and our services can be offered at the treatment program location. It also helps DV programs with referrals to substance use disorder services. There's a listing at the link on the slide to local domestic violence programs by county, and you'd be able to see what program, if you're not familiar with the program, what programs is program within your county. DV services are offered in every county in New York State, but not all counties offer all services. We have resources that are available for information on domestic violence and substance abuse treatment. The first resource is a desk reference guide called Linking Substance Abuse Treatment and Domestic Violence Services. The second resource is the SAMHSA Tip 25. It's a substance abuse treatment and domestic violence guide. There's a quick guide for clinicians available that clinicians can keep as a reference that's based on the Tip 25, and there are also knowledge application keys that include quick resources on batterers' behaviors, safeguarding important documents, and client consent form guidance. The other resources that are available are the New York State Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence and also the New York State OASAS Intimate Partner Violence and Substance Abuse pages on our website. So again, I'm Brenda Bannon, and my contact information is available on the slide. Next, I'd like to introduce Mary Alice Ryan, who will be talking about OASAS providers reporting via the client data system on domestic violence, victimization, and perpetration. Mary Alice, welcome.
Thank you, Brenda. Hello, everyone. My name is Mary Alice Ryan, and I'm with the Office of Alcoholism and Substance Abuse Services in the Division of Outcomes Management and System Information. I would like to talk to you today about the importance of reporting on the domestic violence, intimate partner violence items on the OASAS client discharge form. All OASAS non-crisis treatment programs are required to complete the client discharge form for every discharge. The data from the client discharge form then becomes part of the OASAS client data system and is utilized by the agency for reporting, research, and analysis purposes. And the code word for the form is PAS 45N, as most of you know. There are two domestic violence, intimate partner violence questions on the client discharge form. The first question asks if the client has ever been a domestic violence victim, And the second question asks if the client has ever been a domestic violence perpetrator. We would like you to use data gathered during treatment via screening tools or other treatment episodes and answer the question as completely as possible. Your responses to choose from are yes, no, don't know, or refuse to answer. OASAS has been asking the domestic violence, intimate partner violence questions since 2010. The number of victims and perpetrators in OASAS programs is slowly increasing. As you can see right now, 12.5 of those individuals served in OASAS non-crisis treatment programs identified as domestic violence victims. 6.9% identified as domestic violence perpetrators. Although responses, 94% of programs are screening for domestic violence, we still have 17% are responding to the domestic violence question in the client data system that they don't know or refuse to answer if the client is a domestic violence victim or perpetrator. Again, it's very important to gather your data or your information during treatment and try to answer the question as completely and accurately as possible. Accurate data is important. We also share the results with the Office of Prevention of Domestic Violence for their analysis purposes and posting on their dashboard. As Brenda mentioned, research also shows that if an identified domestic violence issue is addressed during substance abuse treatment, outcomes are much more successful. I'd like to thank you for your time today. My contact information is included if there are any questions. I would now like to introduce Whitney Bonara, Project Coordinator for Universal Response to Domestic Violence for Dutchess County.
Thank you so much, Mary Alice, and thank you to everyone for watching today and learning and giving me the opportunity to talk to you about what we're doing in Dutchess County. My name is Whitney Bonora, and I'm the Project Coordinator for Universal Response to Domestic Violence in Dutchess County. And Universal Response to Domestic Violence is basically our community's coordinated response to domestic violence between service providers, law enforcement, district attorney's office, mental health providers, probation, and so many other dedicated organizations who come together in addressing our community's response to domestic violence. And today, I get the opportunity to talk to you about our most current project, which is the Lethality Assessment Program, or LAP, as we like to call it. So why did we implement the Lethality Assessment Program in Dutchess County? Well, it was in response to a number of domestic violence homicides that we had starting in 2010, and our community came together and decided that we needed to do something to better respond to high-risk and potentially lethal cases of domestic violence. Since our community came together, we've been able to implement a high-risk case management team with a number of partners throughout the community, and we've been in effect since 2012 with that high-risk team. And in the 3-year period that our high-risk team has been ongoing, we've identified 78 cases through referral process that are the most lethal, potentially lethal cases of domestic violence in our community. But one of the things that we have found with the high-risk team is that we knew we could do more. We have one case manager working with all of those cases, and those are only the cases that were known to us, cases that came to us through a variety of referral sources. So we really knew we had the opportunity to do more. And so we knew we were ready for another initiative that could identify high-risk cases earlier in the process. We knew there was an opportunity to do so because oftentimes law enforcement are responding to domestic incidents before cases are known to service providers. So, what is the Lethality Assessment Project, or LAP as we call it? LAP is an easy and effective method that identifies victims of domestic violence who are at risk of being seriously injured or killed by their current or former intimate partners. And what it does is it immediately connects them to domestic violence service providers for safety planning, for referrals, to discuss options that might be available to a victim in that moment. The lethality assessment program was created by the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence, and it's based on more than 2 decades of research by Dr. Jacqueline Campbell of Johns Hopkins University. And what we know is that the goal of LAP is to identify victims of domestic violence who are at the greatest risk of being killed. And the intention of the LAP project was to create a user-friendly, evidence-based instrument as the means of identification. And we know that we can prevent these incidents through getting victims into domestic violence services. Now, one of the things that's important to note about the lethality assessment program and the screen that accompanies that is it's not a screen for domestic violence. The LAP screen doesn't show that there is domestic violence present. What it does show is that in that situation of domestic violence, there's an elevated risk of lethality. So it's important to note that if someone doesn't screen in as being at high risk, it doesn't mean that there's not domestic violence present. It just means that in that moment, at the time they're answering those screening questions, they're not at an elevated risk at that time. What we know about lethality and domestic violence, based on Dr. Jacqueline Campbell's research, is that every year between 1,500 to 1,600 women in the United States are killed by an abuser. What we also know is in the year prior to the homicide, more than 44% of the abusers were arrested, and nearly 1/3 of the victims had contacted the police. However, only 4% of the victims had used a domestic violence hotline or shelter within the year prior to being killed by an intimate partner. We know there's an area for opportunity there when only 4% of the victims had been connected to life-saving services. Now, I did also want to mention that 1,500 to 1,600 number includes the primary female victims of domestic violence. It doesn't include any other collateral victims, such as children who were harmed during the suicide, or potential suicide of the offender as well. And it also does not include other people like law enforcement officers who might have lost their life in an incident like we had with Detective John Falcone in Poughkeepsie a number of years ago. What we know from the research, again, Dr. Jacqueline Campbell's research, is that intimate partner homicides are predictable and they are preventable. Domestic violence services are protective, and those who are at the greatest risk of being killed are not necessarily reaching out for help. And LAP connects high-danger victims who might not reach out for help before or on their own with emergency safety planning services and local resources. Dr. Campbell's research shows us that homicides are predictable because her research demonstrates that there are certain factors present in intimate partner relationships that lead up to homicide or prior to the victim being killed. This makes intimate partner homicide predictable and because of that, preventable. And the basic premise of the LAP is that intimate partner homicide is predictable, and therefore, if we apply an evidence-based approach, we can do some proactive protocols in those situations and hopefully prevent the homicide. Ultimate goal of the lethality assessment program is to prevent homicide or serious reassault through an evidence-based response. What you're seeing now is the lethality screen. This is a field tool that was adapted from Dr. Jacqueline Campbell's danger assessment, which is a longer assessment tool used by clinicians and counselors to assess a victim's risk of homicide or severe reassault. The form that you're seeing is a simple 11-question tool. Yes or no answers. It takes about 1.5 minutes to administer, and it's done on the field through primarily law enforcement officers, but this tool could also be used in emergency rooms by Child Protective Service workers in Dutchess County. In our pilot LAP program, we are utilizing this tool with our law enforcement in our community. The lethality screen contains the factors that are most predictive of homicide. So in that 25 years of Dr. Campbell's research, a couple of factors rose to the top, things that might be present in situations in which domestic violence ended in homicide, things like unemployment of the abuser, things like were there weapons in the home? Are there children present that are not the offender's children? Factors like that rose to the top and were known to be increased in those situations in which homicide was imminent. One of the things that's important to note about the screen is that it's really important to ask all the questions and ask them in order, because the questions do build on top of each other. And again, they're simple yes/no answers, and even if the victim says no or doesn't know or doesn't remember to the questions, just hearing the questions oftentimes elicits a response for victims, and they might share more with the police officer, or else it might just it might just resonate with them and leave them thinking about their situation long after law enforcement are gone. And I'll share a story about that in a little bit. How the lethality assessment program works in Dutchess County, again, that 11-question screen is used on scene by law enforcement to identify victims at the highest risk of homicide. Again, it's not a screen to show that domestic violence is present. It's a screen to show that the domestic violence before us is at elevated risk of homicide. If the victim's responses to those 11 questions indicate an increased risk of homicide, the officer tells the victim that he or she is going to place a call to the Domestic Violence Services, which is one of the service providing organizations in our county. It's a 24-hour hotline, and that officer says that he or she is going to call and seek advice from the advocate, and also encourages the victim to speak with the specially trained hotline advocate. Again, this is always the victim's choice. A victim can decide not to answer the screening questions. They can decide not to speak to an advocate if they do screen in. Every step of that is the victim's choice. But the officer does make the call regardless of whether the victim wants to speak to an advocate or doesn't. One thing that we have found is that the officers in our community are really able to request that a victim consider speaking to an advocate even while they're on the phone, and if they offer that opportunity a couple of times, most of the time victims are taking that chance to speak to an advocate and engage in safety planning and discuss options that are available to them in that moment. If the victim does decide to speak to the advocate on the phone, the advocate will safety plan with them for what they can do that night to keep them safe, and most often they're making a plan for the next day or the next couple of days to follow up, whether that's reporting incidents to law enforcement, whether that's going to family court, whether that's discussing counseling options for themselves and their children. It would be whatever service the victim and the advocate decide would be most appropriate at that time. What's wonderful about the lethality assessment program is that's not where it stops, that the victim is then followed up with by the advocate organization and also by the police department to continue to provide that wraparound service, that ongoing support and encouragement to engage in program services. Now, one of the common questions that I always get when we're talking about the lap screen is, do police officers have to ask the same 11 questions even if they've been to the house more than once? And simple answer to that is yes, because what we have found is that when victims are hearing the questions over and over again, it's, they're kind of storing that in their head, and they are thinking about those questions later on after law enforcement is gone. The best example of this that I can share with you is we had a case locally where one week police were called to a home where there was domestic violence present. The officer initiated the screen and the victim answered no to all 11 questions. So in that instance, they would not be screened in as high risk. The officer's gut was telling them something else was going on, so he again encouraged the victim to go seek out services and connect with someone who might be able to help. At that time, the victim wasn't ready to do that. But the department was at the home the next week. Someone else had called law enforcement after hearing an argument, and again, it happened to be the same officer, did all 11 of those questions. Again, the victim answered no to all 11 questions, but the officer's gut was really speaking to him, and so he decided to make a phone call to Domestic Violence Services irregardless of the victim's answers. Encouraged the victim to speak on the phone. The victim declined. But again, the protocol was set in place, and the victim continued to think about the questions that the officer were asking. The next week, the victim, who had answered no to all of the screening questions the 2 prior times, walked into the police department to report additional incidents that had happened of domestic violence, and actually said to the person who was taking the report, "I've been thinking about the questions that the officer asked me, and now I want to tell you what's been happening." In that instant, the third time, the victim answered yes to a number of questions, screening her in at high risk of homicide, and was connected immediately to services that could help her. And it was only by asking those 11 screening questions multiple times that the victim really began to get a sense of the danger that she was in. The questions, as you can see, are very pointed, but they do allow victims the opportunity to think about the amount of danger that they're in. So we know that it is important to continue to ask all of the screening questions, even if the victim is answering no to all of them, and even if you are at the home more than once over a period of time. Just to point out how our pilot project is going in Dutchess County, it's a collaboration between two main service provider organizations, Family Services, Domestic Violence Services, and also the Grace Smith House, which is the residential emergency shelter in our community. Currently, we have 6 police departments that are on board with the project: the New York State Police, Dutchess County Sheriff's Office, Hyde Park, East Fishkill, Town of Poughkeepsie, and City of Poughkeepsie. We've got just under half of our departments on board, and this was done purposefully. We didn't roll out countywide to all 15 departments in our county immediately. We wanted to make sure that we had all our ducks in a row, if you will, that all of the policies and protocols were in place before we went around and asked all of the departments in our community to join into this really important and life-saving initiative. Of important things to note is there has been no money that has come into this department, or that has come into this project rather, and all of the departments who are on board, the service providers who are on board because of their commitment to the issue of domestic violence, because it's near impossible to ignore this amount of evidence, and knowing that we can predict and that homicides and domestic violence can be prevented. So again, it's with that knowledge and this opportunity that the people have come to the table in our community. We're not only helping victims, we know, but domestic violence calls are some of the most dangerous calls that law enforcement can go on. And so we know that when we are working with our officers, we're not only helping keep victims and their families safe, but we're also keeping police officers safe, as again, DV calls are just about the most dangerous ones that they can go on. How are we doing so far in Dutchess County? Actually, it's been working quite well. We've been in operation since May of 2014, with our most recent department coming on just this past summer. And we are showing great success. Out of the 566 lethality screens that have been completed across our county, 40% are screening in via their answers to the questions, meaning 40% of the victims are screening in an elevated risk for lethality, elevated risk for being killed in their domestic violence situation. It's important to note that we also have 5% of those cases are screening in because the officer's gut is telling them something is just not resonating in what they're hearing, that perhaps a victim might not be indicating yes to answers on the screening questions, but we do allow for that gut factor, that the officers can screen someone in at high risk if they're feeling like their gut is telling them that this is a risky situation. Even more important and even more wonderful is that in the situations where victims are screening in as high risk, 78% of them are connecting with an advocate on scene. When the police respond and make contact with the domestic violence hotline, victims have the opportunity in that moment to talk with an advocate 24 hours a day to create safety plans, to create a plan for the next day for what they might want to do in their situation, and talk about options that are available to them to keep themselves and their families safe. Oftentimes we're asked, what does this look like long term? Are victims who are being connected on scene remaining connected ongoing? And I'm very happy to say that so far that's what we're seeing. And 63% of the victims who have made connections on scene, again when law enforcement are present and they're speaking with an advocate on the phone, those clients are continuing with services ongoing, whether that's going to family court to obtain orders of protection, continued support with law enforcement and reporting additional incidents, counseling, hotline usage. It's whatever service the victim feels most appropriate for them at that time. I'm just very happy to say that the majority of the victims who are connected through the lethality assessment program are remaining connected, which allows them additional time to think about options that can create safety for themselves and for their families. I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about substance abuse and domestic violence, given the invitation for me to come here today. It's one of those well-researched pieces of linkage, and we know that there is a complex connection between substance abuse and domestic violence. We know it's complex, but we also know that substance abuse is not the cause of domestic violence. Approximately half of all domestic violence incidents in the United States do begin with drinking. That knowledge comes from both the Department of Justice and the World Health Organization. And we know that substances do affect an offender's ability to perceive and integrate and process information. So there could be something to be said about that distortion in an abuser's thinking. Doesn't cause the violence, but it might increase the risk that the abuser will misinterpret his partner's or another's behavior. We also know that alcohol affects cognitive and physical functions, reducing self-control and leaving individuals less capable of negotiating nonviolent resolution to conflict. Bringing it back to lethality indicators, in homes where there might be weapons present, that elevated risk of lethality coupled with substance use could be a potentially very dangerous situation, as substance abuse can increase the frequency but also the severity of domestic violence incidents. What we also know too is that substance abuse is not an excuse for violence. Research does indicate that ending substance abuse alone will not end the domestic violence, as the domestic violence tendencies will still exist. But we know that substance abuse often contributes to domestic violence situations, be it an aggressive level, or sometimes even partners who are arguing about substance abuse can lead to domestic incidents. Also, a similar question that some of you all might be thinking is, why aren't there questions about the substance abuse or alcohol use on the lap screen? Factors that are not included in those 11 questions are alcohol and substance abuse, frequency and severity of assault, animal abuse, and pregnancy. Those are factors that are more attributable to reassault rather than lethality. So for the 11 questions that are present on the lap screen, it's really those indicators that rose to the top as having the greatest indication that there is a homicide that is potentially imminent. There are questions that are related to alcohol and illegal drug use, and they are asked on the longer 20-question danger assessment that was developed by Dr. Jacqueline Campbell. You all do have that as handouts. However, this assessment takes about an hour or an hour and a half to perform, and that is done by a trained advocate or counselor or mental health professional who's been certified in that danger assessment. And that allows for more time to go into those questions more about substance and illegal substance abuse. Something that can't be done in the minute and a half it takes on scene to ask those 11 questions when officers are doing the assessment on scene. That was a very quick presentation on the work that we're doing, lethality assessment project in Dutchess County, and I really want to thank you all for giving me the opportunity, particularly as October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, for me to come and share the work that we're doing in Dutchess County. We have found the LAP program to be quite worthwhile and successful in our own community. We're looking to grow it in our own community, and if anybody who is watching this training is interested in learning how the lethality assessment program or other high-risk initiatives might be beneficial to their community, I invite you to give me a call or send me an email. And also the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence, that organization that did create the LAP form, they have a fantastic website that you can go, you can see information about the lethality assessment program and make connections to see if it might actually be ongoing in your community. So thank you again. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to share what we're doing with you all today.
I'd like to take a moment to thank Mary Alice, Brenda, and Whitney for their time, for their knowledge, and for their support in making our provider system more aware of domestic violence and what we can do to begin to address it more effectively. For your evaluation for this presentation, we appreciate it. It's one way that you let OASAS know if we are meeting your educational needs, if we are offering you the information that is relevant to your population, and so forth. So if you would take a brief moment, I would appreciate if you could fill the survey out, and it can simply be accessed at the following SurveyMonkey link. That being said, thank you for joining us, and as another reminder, feel free to send questions at any time to learningthurs@oasas.ny.gov. This is Patty. Enjoy your day. Bye now.